Hi everyone, thanks for coming along tonight to what will be a really interesting talk from Alejandro. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsor, Plus UTS Business Futures. Plus UTS Business Futures is the enterprise learning arm of UTS Business School and strong supporters of behavioral meetups, having delivered a range of customized and co-designed programs for leading orgs in highly collaborative ways, including CBA, RBA, ASIC, New South Wales Health, John Holland, Lionco, and many others. Plus UTS Business Futures is very experienced and very able to assist your organization achieve its goals through tailored, informative, and inspirational capability building programs that upskill your staff in ways that are relevant to your org. If you'd like to inquire further, please email PlusUTS on business.futures@uts.edu.au or get in touch with me and I'll put you in touch. So we're very lucky to be joined by Alejandro today. And I had the good fortune of meeting Alejandro 10 years ago whilst he was studying at Oxford. The breadth and depth of his knowledge of human behavior has always amazed me. Alejandro is a global co-founder of Atriana, university professor and industry leader who combines psychological insights with practical innovation. He's led over 400 interdisciplinary projects in 25 countries, working with top-tier companies and transform learning experiences in classrooms from Bogota to Oxford. I don't know how you got to 400, mate, because that baby face of yours. He has a multidisciplinary approach, which we'll see today as he digs deeper than demographics to explain the complexities behind our day-to-day decisions. If everyone can write their questions in the chat, and we'll do a Q&A at the end, and then over to you, mate.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me today. Thanks so much to the university for organizing this space and to our sponsors. It's really fantastic. I'm so happy that despite the very different time zones, we are here together. Thank you so much for everyone who woke up. I can see some familiar faces, so I'm really grateful because that means you're actually waking up with me, which is remarkable. And I hope I don't disappoint you. And I want to begin talking about variability. I think variability is one of those things everyone that studies behavior in some way tackles, right? Either because you hate it, because when you run your stats, variability is too big and then you get nothing, right? And you're like, variability screwed up my project. Or because to some degree you're looking for specific variability. You're trying to understand how some specific pattern of variability changes the way a society works, or helps you understand a specific part of a society, of a population, of a group of people. But if we think about variability from a sort of a macro, sort of systemic perspective, variability is inevitable, right? To a degree. All humans, when you round up many humans, when you take them all together, there will be some that will not act the way we expect. There will be some that will act completely against what we'd hope they act, right? Say in terms of violence, or in terms of the way they save money, or the way they relate to other people, right? We would hope that they act in a specific way, but they might act in a different way. And sometimes variability is generated by environmental factors, right? And we will discuss this in a moment, but environmental factors could be things like temperature, it could be the weather, it could be things like as simple as the color of a wall, or something to do with the urban development, right? Like the way the city is designed, the way certain things are sort of made up to be in a specific way. And then you can have variability caused by individual characteristics, our personality, our beliefs, and many other things. And yes, we could argue that those things might not be inherently individual. Some of these might actually be formed by our interaction with the environment. But once we get them, once we have them, they are to a degree ours and therefore individual. And then we have variability that stems from individual environment interactions. And we will focus a lot there because that's what I promised you I would do, right? About the sort of butterfly effect thing where we get these changes in people and how they co-occur with who we are and what is going on in the outside world. And once we talk about the environment, let's begin with a very short sort of example. This is one of my favorite ones because it was one that really shocked me when I saw it the first time, right? So when you go to cities that are densely populated, that are where a lot of people live, and you take transportation systems, say like the one in Bogota, Colombia, or the one in Sao Paulo, Mexico City, right? Cities that have a high density. Imagine just a transportation system that moves about 5.5 million people every day. That already gives you an idea, right? You take this number and you multiply it by every day of the week, and you get roughly in a week the same people that go to Disney World in a year or something like that. So that kind of puts things in perspective. It's I wouldn't say a lot, but maybe too many people in the same space in the same span of time. But what you look at here is when something like rain occurs, which is something very common, for example, in Bogota, where I was born, we get heavy rains and very sudden, right? You can't really react quickly enough to rains in Bogota because the city kind of likes you to get wet, right? There's a point where you just can't seem to get ready for it. You can only sort of get wet and that's it. And when you look at these, look at that. We took about 80 decibels as the baseline for too much noise, right? And so when you see 75% or 94% here at decibels, it's just basically because I wanted to standardize the percentages so we could all look at percentages and not decibels versus percentages. But when we see 75%, that means we're at 75% to 80 decibels, and 94% means we're at 94% of 80 decibels, meaning we kind of got there, right? So when it rains, we reach the very noisy sort of environment within the bus stations of almost 80 decibels, quite noisy. But beyond also the fact that something that is 80 decibels loud is quite loud for someone just walking in a city. Look at the issue with noise. So you get white noise, not just the decibels, but white noise goes up almost more than 40%. And if you think about white noise, right, it's kind of the same noise that's not letting you sleep in the plane, right? It's kind of the same noise that when you land, you're like, finally, this sort of very annoying TV with no signal is off and you kind of want to get out really quickly. But look at the anxiety as well. We're getting a spike of about 20% of anxiety in people when it's raining versus when it's sunny. And this is what we call sort of variability caused by the environment. It's not precisely about who we are. It's not precisely about how we woke up that day. It's more related to what happened to the weather in this case. And here we're not talking about it, but also the heat, the change in humidity, all of these things can have a change in how we behave. And what we've discovered is that in certain cities in the world, they have copied bus stations for what we call rapid bus transit systems, like the one you're seeing in the back, slightly the red one. These rapid bus transit systems are cheaper to build than, say, metros, and they have had, I guess, mixed results, but seem to be more efficient than just having the traditional bus in the highways. But what does happen is that many of these sort of stations have been copied from smaller cities, and they've constructed them from very lightweight materials, but are also very noisy. And no one thought about how much noise these materials caused, for example, when it's raining. So you get this sort of metallic roof and metallic floor, and you get the very heavy rain, and then it amplifies the noise inside the stations. So while you're waiting, and while it's more people are getting into these stations, right, because it's raining and they want to get out of the rain, you get a combination of a lot of people with almost 80 decibels of sound. So giving you this sort of sensation, right, of being sort of trapped in a very noisy environment. And as anxiety raises, what psychology, neuroscience, sociology, anthropology have taught us is that when people get anxious, they change the way they see the world. Like a sort of a more of a survival behavior gets triggered. So the more anxiety you have, the more you think about yourself, the less you think about others. And this becomes a very important sort of story, not only for transportation systems in very densely populated cities, but it tells us that when you have very large cities, when you have very densely populated places, what you end up having is a higher level of noise and therefore a higher level of anxiety. And it explains why we seem to be less altruistic, at least to a degree, in larger cities, whether compared to smaller cities. We seem to be more focused on ourselves, more concerned about our survival than, say, when you're in a little town and just can walk everywhere because it's quite small, or you can bike everywhere because it's quite small. And this gives you a sort of understanding maybe that it is not that certain regions of the world are just basically more violent, or that we are born more violent. As I remember seeing some newspapers suggesting about certain parts of the world. But it might just be that the conditions we've generated in these massive cities is just making us a bit less altruistic and a bit more violent as well. And what you get in these cities, obviously, with this anxiety is that the higher the anxiety, the more they damage public property, the more they push other people to get into the bus or out of the bus and things like that. It just makes life harder and creates a more of a domino effect, right? Where you get a sort of feeling that makes people sort of less prone to help, right? So you get anxious with the sound, you get anxious about with a change of humidity, with a change of temperature, and then you start pushing. So as you push other people, more people get more anxious, and you get this sort of snowball effect that it's kind of ironic of a snowball if we were talking about rain, but yes, exactly, snowball effect. And all of this sort of environmental sort of factors that change variability come to two words called turning points. Turning points were sort of introduced by information theory maybe about 50 years ago or so. And they're quite fascinating. When I discovered them, I was like, how is it that I have not read about this before? And many of you that obviously come maybe from engineering fields are like, oh, this is quite obvious. Turning points, how did you not know? And I think we don't know because we only read in our field, right? I'm trying to change that. My library keeps growing and I'm still obsessed with buying physical books, which is problematic in so many ways. And sorry for the carbon footprint, just to say one thing. But we really need to read outside our fields to get a better grasp of behavior. And turning points are fascinating because it's basically, when you look at turning points through the lens of neuroscience and engineering, you discovered one thing, which is a turning point is a moment, a specific moment in time and space where you have volition, the ability to make a decision, right? And what neuroscience will tell us is that we are not really very free as individuals, like humans, as us, this kind of animal that we are, is not very free in general. Most of our decisions are very automatic, or they're based on our very well-formed attitudes and beliefs and our previous choices. And we have a limited range of how we react based on our personal experience and our genetic design. So a lot of the time, we're just basically kind of going in a mix between autopilot and a sort of driver that makes sure that we won't crash in the process of doing autopilot, right? Kind of like how a plane works. You kind of the pilot is really important when it's taking off. The pilot is really important when it's kind of landing. In between, the pilot is supposed to make sure that we don't crash into anything weird, like a bird or something. But in general, the plane kind of does it all on its own. And most of the time, the decisions we feel we are making and this sort of freedom we feel is more like a psychological illusory effect caused by our brain to make us feel independent, so we don't sort of lose hope in ourselves and say, why am I living? This sucks. I'm just kind of leaving, right? But then there's these very sort of crucial moments during daily life where something might happen in the world. and you get a turning point, right? And these turning points, right, are caused most of the time by environmental factors. Something that has changed in the environment, something that has changed in the context that you're immersed in, that forces you to wake up your brain fully and say, okay, sort of driver, Mr. Person, you, identity of this body, we need you to do something because we have no idea what to do. And it tells us a lot about consciousness, not from a very philosophical or very sort of cognitive only perspective, but about its role in the functioning of our societies. And it's that consciousness and freedom is designed for us to handle uncertainty. The greater the uncertainty in a system, the more conscious we are and the more free we are to make decisions. And that sounds great, but it isn't sometimes, right? Sometimes when you let people choose, they'll choose really poorly. And just look at how governments are being sort of selected around the world, right? How much democracy has advanced in, say, the last 2 decades. And sometimes we're not sure anymore how much it's really advanced in certain parts of the world. So when you actually let people choose things, it's not always the best sort of outcome, because sometimes we choose from our biases or we choose from our personal experience. And so the bigger the turning point, the more options we get. And so the greater the decision instability. And we were just discussing transportation systems. And when we discussed transportation systems, I still remember an engineer that I met maybe, what was it, maybe 2016. And he said something like, I'm so frustrated because we had this massive bottleneck problem in the station where a lot of people were taking off at the station, and they were taking a different sort of line, right? But it was just too many people. So we designed another route that was perfect for them through this bus, right? But people in the city were not used to taking that specific sort of route to go to the city center. So for them, it was counterintuitive to take that route. So they would get off and they would see the sign saying new route, and it'll take you 10 less minutes or 15 less minutes, depending on the time. And they would be like, can't be, not possible. It's really weird to take this, right? And because the system had been very unstable in sort of the way they delivered the service, people were very wary that it might just be a mistake of the service. So no one would take the new route, and they would just say, you know, I'm just taking the old one because I need to get to work or I'll get fired. And this one's for sure. And so it didn't work. And he said, I'm so frustrated. People don't understand. People are just not understanding what they need to do. They're just doing the same thing. And I told them, I think you did give them the information and they did consider it. You did create a turning point, but they're not taking the decision you expected because you assumed that all people think like engineers and that all people will understand this message you're giving them because it's in the same language they speak. But the way they view the world is different. So until you actually created enough sort of safety to make that decision, people did not take the ideal, the obvious, the engineered route, but they were just kind of looking at things and saying, there is instability and I'm just going to do this. And they just picked a decision that made sense to them. So we have to decide when we want to generate a turning point. We want to make sure that this situation, this moment that we are creating for a greater opportunity for freedom is ideal, that we kind of hint or give enough options for people to make that choice. But if you're thinking, for example, things like a brand, like a consumer brand, turning points the savior, the status quo, right? So if you're the leading brand, the last thing you want is a turning point, because that will make people think and say, you know, I'm eating too much sugar. Why am I eating this, right? But if maybe you're building a policy to get people to eat healthier, you do want a turning point. You want people to go to the supermarket and for the first time in maybe 5 years or 10 years say, why am I buying this thing? Why am I eating this way, right? You want them to ask that for the first time. Truly ask it, not say, oh, I should cut on sugar and have this automatic behavior of worrying, but continue in this path of behavior. So we want turning points when we want to change the status quo, and we should try to mitigate turning points when the status quo is actually benefiting people, whether it's making them safer, healthier, more protected, more altruistic, sort of more positive in their behavior. But what also happens is that if you generate excessive turning points, then it consumes a lot of energy, because the brain is not designed to always be in sort of an uncertainty state and having to really think about things. Most of the time, we just kind of want to get on with our lives. So it's the typical case of those restaurants you get there, right? And this has this massive menu. And you start looking at the options and you're like, okay, so fish with peas, and then fish with carrots, and then your fish with tomatoes, and you're a bit like, there's a lot of fish here, and it kind of seems like the same thing to me with just a little change. And it might just be very different, and it might taste massively different. But when you get 20 options, the brain is a bit like, so we've got fish here, and this is very confusing. We got 20 types of fish, and then 20 types of meat, and then 20 types of vegetarian options. You're a little bit like overwhelmed by it. So we have to find a sort of sweet spot to the amount or to the level of turning points that we want in a given situation. But there's another catch, and it's that if there are no turning points, if you feel like you've made no decisions and things that just kind of flow automatically, the memorability of the situation is reduced, right? So you want people to have a certain degree of choice if you want them to remember, deeply remember, right? To say, I chose this, I did this, this was my decision, right? So you either make them invest a lot of energy, but that's risky because people might say, I don't want to invest a lot of energy. But the other one is saying you give them one or two options and people feel like, wow, this is me, I did it, this is important. So they remember it more deeply and more importantly. So when governments say things like, we're getting, I don't know, a drought, and it's a terrible drought, and they tell them, save water or we'll fine you, right? You're generating there a sort of very sort of directed non-turning point behavior. But people have been consuming water, say, for that whole year in a specific way, or for a whole decade in a specific way. And what you're basically saying is threatening them, you have to do this. Otherwise, I'll be mean to you. And what will happen is that a lot of people will have a very automatic behavior. And because it's automatic, it's going to be very difficult to change. And if you don't give them options, if you don't generate a certain turning point, people might just say, well, I'll just pay the fine. And if you don't think that this is true, we studied 9 cities that had droughts in a period of a decade. And we discovered that in a lot of the places, people paid basically a fine instead of cutting back on water. And so the city got money, they got richer as a city, but you can't sometimes buy water. You can't fix a drought with money, right? You can't just say, oh, we've got this ton of money from the fines from people spending more water. So now just buy more water. It's a drought. You can't. The only thing that can solve the problem is people consuming less water. So if you don't create a change in the behavior, even if you actually threaten people or generate a punitive measure, people may not change their behavior. And here are a few examples of turning points. The flavor of a product is a turning point, right? So if you've got strawberry and blackberry or raspberry or passion fruit, these options are turning point, but they're small turning points, just enough to make you feel special, just enough to make you remember, right? If you get options in our new restaurant menu, you've never been to the restaurant, it's your first time, lots of turning points. You're kind of like saying, what do I do? What do I do? Right? You kind of have to think about it. And something more complicated, sort of more polemic. So you like liking more than one person at the same time. Massive turning points, massive problem, massive situation for you because you get these multiple options, multiple scenarios. You get to build a lot of Hollywood films in your head about how things will play out before you make a decision. Generally, the wrong decision. Sorry to say that, but yes, lots of different things. And when we move on from environmental factors to individual traits, this is sort of a very quick, reduced way. Don't hate me if you're an expert in personality or if you're an expert in psychology and you're like, how are you basically summarizing the entire 5 personality traits in a one slide. It's because I have about 40 minutes for us to have a good conversation and then more questions so we can have a better discussion. But it's when you think about these 5 big traits and we change the names of the typical psychology scary things like neuroticism or mental instability or things like that, and we just kind of look at them in a more sort of everyday perspective. We get people that are more risk prone, like the wanderers, right? They respond to reward. They're better at capturing rewards and searching for rewards, right? They're very gregarious, positive, thrill-seeking, very emotionally positive in general. Then you get warriors, which respond to threat. So they're very vigilant and they can push themselves further than most people because they're more worried about what could happen than about the reward. So it actually gives you some understanding. They're more impulsive, more anxious, and also more restrained. And this dichotomy between impulsivity and restraint is because you get a maximum set of dopamine in your brain. And when you deplete that dopamine that is helping you regulate and plan, and you overuse your frontal cortex to inhibit too much because you're too worried about the future, finally the dopamine gets depleted and you can no longer inhibit your behavior, and then you become really, really impulsive. So people that are highly anxious move from being very sort of restrained to being very impulsive all the time. And you can look at shopping behaviors, at social interactions, or positive sort of civic behavior, where you get people that are very sort of law-abiding and then suddenly not law-abiding at all. And then you get empathizers, or this dimension makes you respect people more harmonious, socially friendly, avoids conflict, more warm, more trusting. You get poets, more sort of unusual, more sort of able to connect different kinds of ideas and divergent in a way, artistically sensitive, creative, imaginative. And then you get people like the controllers, more organized, planning, self-controlled, competent, detailed, self-disciplined, more law-abiding, better at planning. And when you take these traits, we know that there is a certain distribution, populational distribution for each of these traits in people. And when we look at these, I want to show you how individual differences influence massive behavior. 5 million people, 10 million people, 100 million people. So here we've got about 10,000 people analyzed. And what we basically asked was, okay, so how much do you like the experience of hopping on a bus? So basically the x-axis is basically going to the station, going through the pay thing, right? Then looking for information to where you have to go, walking to where you have to wait for the bus, waiting for the bus, hopping on the bus, traveling, getting down from the bus, right? And what we analyzed with these 10,000 people was basically how positive was each of the 4 sensory dimensions. We didn't measure taste because we just didn't want to know, right? If it was a negative taste experience or a positive taste, I don't want to know what you're tasting in a bus. So we just didn't ask that one because, yeah, no, thank you. But you hear how much sort of sound, how much olfaction, tactile or visual information. And what you get here is a sort of a positive experience up until you get on the bus in rush hour, in peak hour. And it kind of looks very average. And this is where we learn, and most of you who probably know more statistics than I do, learn that you don't trust averages because generally averages represent no one. They're just kind of weird, right? It's a middle ground, right? But when you divide this in terms of personality traits, look at this. These are the more sort of inhibited, controller, organized, meticulous, neat, disciplined, good at self-planning and organization. And if you look at this, the same graph suddenly is all positive. They're like, well, I expected this to be a bit messy, and I expected this to be a bit full, and I expected this to be a bit noisy and chaotic, so I'm fine with it. I planned for it. I anticipated it. I'm fine. Look at these. When you look at people which are higher in warrior, worse at planning, less empathetic, less altruistic, more anxious, Nothing is positive. For them, the entire experience is negative. So this sort of average system that you use to measure net promoter scores, that you use to measure things like total quality, or the serve qual, pro qual models to measure services. A lot of the time, what you're looking at is an average of personality traits. And when you break them down and you look at this, you suddenly discover that your very average service is basically not so average. It's just being divided into at least two kinds of people based on their personality traits. And the same experience filtered by those brains, by those cognitive systems, is creating entirely different interpretations based by those genetic and sort of life experience sort of influenced traits. And you get these, which we call the flexibles, that actually look a little bit more like the average, right? But you get a breakdown like sort of the adaptables, the first ones are about a quarter of the population. So it's 25% of people that are happy. And then you get a 75%, which is either kind of like, nah, or I hate this, which is not very good for a brand, obviously. And when we keep going forward, this is another example of something we did. So we took a need machine learning model. We took about 2 billion sort of data points from conversations, from sort of recordings, from social listening. Everything was above board, just because now I know everyone is like, did you do this legally? Yes, we paid people, we asked for permission, we did the whole sort of thing. It was very expensive. And we took these 2 billion data points and we transformed them into about something like a bit shy of 1,000 sort of categories, dimensions. And we reduced those 1,000 of categories into 26 sort of keywords. And we identified patterns in those keywords, which basically related to what was going on in the headspace of people. What were people thinking about? The topics, or the structural topics, more about security, being very clean, not feeling enough pleasure, feeling lonely, distrusting institutions, right? Desire for fairness, rejection of technology, things like that. So we looked at these sort of patterns, and we looked at which of these sort of keywords emerged more often in people's minds, more in their thoughts and their daily lives. And we identified sort of a few sort of keywords which were being more existential, looking more for self-improvement or balance, being more materialistic, looking for freedom, being more connected, being more essential. And what we saw in these were something like structural attitudes, sort of patterns that through which people sort of look at the world, regardless of circumstance, of age, regardless of things like that. So we identified that if you took, for example, your personality traits, and you kind of looked at these, like the pattern of your personality traits, and then you filter them through like a second stage of which of these sort of structural attitudes were more sort of frequent in your mind, you had a better chance of predicting how people respond to in large population dynamics than only personality or only attitudes. And it was really neat because you then looked at how people dressed, and it correlated how people made shopping decisions, and it correlated. How you looked at things like how anti-civic or pro-civic your behavior was, how altruistic, how anxious or how violent you were prone to be, or how prone you were to, for example, not pay the bus fare, how prone you were to just basically skip and not pay the bus fare. And what we discovered, it was that it was a good sort of prediction of how specific environmental factors influenced people based on these very structural, very sort of stable traits. And by stable, I mean, yes, they can change, but we are more likely to kind of stay this way than to change in general. And that kind of makes us think that if we are able to measure specific traits and build a like sort of a vectorized model, then we can start to think that we have a specific range of secondary potential behaviors. But if you look at all these sort of patterns that look like a random variability in individuals, and you kind of vectorize it, you can then predict what will be the most dominant, most likely behavior, how prone we are to behave in a specific way. And this is what I've done for the last maybe 4 or 5 years now, trying to figure out how we can create sort of vectors that predict how people respond to things, and this comes all of this comes to a basic concept, which is the hare hawk paradox, right? So you've got this little bunny, this hare, and this bird, hawk, right? And so if you train these two animals, right, to fly in a straight line when you order them to, and to jump, or to just kind of tread very quickly on the ground with a hare very quickly, and you measure their speed. Let's say that they actually, when the weather is perfect, blue sky, no sort of wind, anything, right? Both the hare and the hawk travel at the same speed in a straight line. And if we understand that both the hawk and the hare travel at the same speed in a straight line with everything else constant, and you go to the football field, or any sort of field, right? And you order the bird and the rabbit to go as fast as possible to the other side, and you know that the weather's perfect. There are no changes. Which one will come first? Which one will arrive first? And so the answer very quickly is, well, we might try to say, well, there's a catch, right? Alejandro's trying to trick us, but no, I'm not. The answer is, obviously, we know they travel at the same distance. We know that everything else is constant. So no, we know that they'll both reach the same point across the field at the same time. And what this sort of hawk-hare paradox teaches us is that sometimes we are obsessed with measuring everything from the person, or assuming that all variability, all differences are important. But not all differences are important to define the outcome of a system, right? So more violent, less violent, more anxious, less anxious. There might be a ton of difference between all of us that are relevant in some contexts, but are not in others. And so despite the fact that the hare has to jump all the way across the field and the hawk flies, and they're massively different, right? In the end, the outcome of the system is determined by the speed. So if I measure the speed and I can vectorize that, then I only need that specific variable to then understand what will happen at the other side of the field. So I might be obsessed with trying to understand all these different things about people, but the question is, which of our individual traits are relevant to determine the outcome of a system, of that specific system? So in transportation, or in education, or in consumer behavior, or in different things. And the answer a lot of the time is, well, sometimes we are very obsessed with trying to find differences between people, and it becomes very expensive to measure things, because we are too obsessed with thinking we're all special, we're all different, therefore we have to measure so many things. But the real question is, which variables determine the outcome of the system? And just to reach the final part of this conversation, which I hope hasn't bored you to death, and especially the people in my time zone, when I'm not saying, I woke up for this, are you crazy? What happened? Hopefully not. But when we think about individual environment sort of interactions, I like to think a lot about well, I'm sorry about that. It might be just because it's 5 a.m. here, but retaliatory behaviors. And it's when you get something bad that happens to you, say you go to your bank and they mistreat you, or something's wrong, or you call your mobile carrier, right, your cell phone carrier, and it's a mess, and your phone is not working properly, or your internet is not working properly. What we've learned so far from addiction research is that emotional experiences accumulate in the brain. We have like a sort of a quantic counter that calculates how much pleasure, how much pain we've experienced in a given situation. And while we may not be able to retrieve the entire experience every time we are again in a context, the brain does measure to a degree the amount of pleasure or pain we've experienced in the past to determine our behavior in the immediate moment. So what happens with services, what happens with public policies, with sort of government-wide models, is that we are a lot of the time assuming that everyone that gets into the system, into the service experience, into the interaction with the city, is coming in a sort of tabula rasa, in a very sort of clean slate situation. But it's not true. We are actually getting there with our previous emotional sedimentation, be it positive or be it negative. And that explains why when a company like Apple screws up, they make a mistake, people forgive them because the positive emotional sedimentation is massive. And they say, okay, I get it. You screwed up with the phone, you broke this thing, but I love you, right? And then in contrast, when a government or when something where you're used to having problems screws up, makes a mistake, you're very inquisitive, you're very unforgiving. And it's not because you're a mean person, it's because you have too much negative emotional sedimentation. So anti-civic behavior is caused by this sort of retaliatory behavior where your brain is measuring how much negative emotions you get every time you interact with the system, right? So the bus is late, or the internet is not working properly, the service is terrible. And you get these anxiety, you get this sort of negative feelings, and that causes all of this problem to sort of, in a way, create this expectation of a negative outcome, and this expectation obviously puts you in a state of uncertainty, in a state of conflict, of chaos that will eventually lead you to create a problem. And so I like this sort of little video. It's like a metaphor of thinking about how you get this sort of sedimentation. It kind of builds up, and because it builds up, you ultimately get a problem or a situation where people will not behave the way you expect them to behave because it's not a clean slate. People are not getting there to your service, interacting with the city, hopping on a bus, getting to class in the morning or in the afternoon, and they're not a clean slate. They've experienced things before, and they have a specific expectation based on those emotional experiences. So a lot of the time when we think of, sort of example, customer acquisition costs, or when we want to promote civic behaviors, or when we want to, for example, generate more positive interactions between people, or increase the rate of learning in a class, we should be thinking of how to prevent negative emotional sedimentation, or how to be able to remove negative emotional sedimentation. So think about it as a river, right? I don't know how it works in your countries, but because we are in the equator here and we get so much rain, rivers eventually get a lot of sedimentation, right? A lot of dirt, a lot of sand gets into the riverbank, and it starts sort of accumulating, and it causes the river to be less deep, right? So you can't navigate it. You get all these problems. So eventually, you have to get a machine there to take out a lot of that sand, a lot of that dirt, right, and remove it so the river functions properly again, right? So we have to think about how to do that with our brains, right? We need to get the machine there at some point and remove part of the sedimentation we don't want. Obviously, better to prevent it, but if you can't prevent it, at least plan for it, right? And if you know you're going to have a negative experience, you have to think about how much that will sediment, how much that will cause the brain to sort of expect something negative and prime the person to behave in a very negative sort of a way. And once we understand this, we can really plan for this sedimentation. And think about this. This is what we call customer experience management. When it's done properly, what happens is that even if you make a mistake, what you're really doing in the end is removing that negative sedimentation. And what happens a lot of the time with sort of massive population dynamics, with massive sort of public policies, is that we are not thinking about the sedimentation. We're just figuring out, okay, we'll fine you, or we'll threaten you, or we'll put you in jail. But the question in the end is there a way to remove the sedimentation so that we can reduce the amount of energy, the amount of taxes we have to spend policing people and getting them to behave in a specific way. And here's another cool example, which is how the way we categorize is also influenced by individual environment systems. So the way where we were born, and how we are taught, and the way we interact with context builds a way builds or determines how we absorb knowledge and how we categorize knowledge. So cognitively speaking, categorization is a mechanism that enables us to reduce the amount of energy needed to make a decision, right? So basically, what does that mean? That categories are not there to help us understand the world perfectly, but they're there to help us make decisions quickly about the world. So if I were to ask any of you, so what does an ice cream shop sell? You'll say, Alejandro, are you crazy? Ice cream shops sell ice cream, right? And then I'd ask you, but how did you know? Did you go to all ice cream shops and ask them, hi, do you sell ice cream? You're a bit like, well, I don't have to because I'm not stupid, right? I know they sell ice cream. And the way we do that is that we build sort of models where we categorize things and we assume or we expect them to function in a specific way. And that helps us sort of move around the world. Imagine if we had to question every single thing we know every single time we make a decision. That sounds like a terrible way to spend our lives. So categories are important. But when we put those sort of categorization systems into sort of social interactions, they can also increase bias. So things like xenophobia, racism, homophobia, right? Machismo, things like that, they're caused by a categorization system, basically misplacing an interpretation. We just say, this is what's happening, so I'm going to put it here, and I just leave it there. And it's based on the categories we have available and the way we were brought up, or the values or the cultural interactions or these things, right? But we have to remember these, because a lot of the time, the reason why behavior is so hard to change is because categorization is helping us become more efficient at making decisions. And so we have to find a way to reduce the amount of energy required to change, or the amount of energy, or to, in a way, be persuasive about how we can be efficient and still change the category. And last, hopefully, you're not too bored yet. This is you're the first people to see it. We've just finished it. And hope you find it interesting. But one thing that has obsessed me over the last maybe 6-7 years, especially since I came back to Latin America, is corruption. I'm tired of corruption, and I'm not tired just like, oh, corruption, I hate corruption. But it's like, as a nerd, as a scientist, I wanted to say, how can we fix this thing, or at least understand it? And this wasn't my field, and it's still not my field. And hopefully some of you can give me more ideas. But I started reading about corruption, and I discovered we have a ton of papers that talk about the horrible negative systemic impact that corruption has on everything, right? Basically, corruption is the worst, like, it's terrible. I know you probably said, yes, we know that. But when you look at the individual sort of situation, like how corruption is formed, like how do you become a corrupt person, or what kind of corrupt people there are, I didn't find that many papers compared to the measuring of systemic impacts about corruption. So I decided to try and build a model. So what we did here is we took about, I can't remember, but roughly 200 million points, where we scrapped newspaper headlines and newspaper stories, and sort of legal processes against politicians and famous people. And we also analyzed rumors on social media, like people saying, oh, this person's never going to get convicted, but he's rotten and he's horrible and he's evil. And we talk all this information, and inspired by a few biologists that I used to work with, and a geneticist at Oxford. I said, how about we imagine corrupt behavior not as people stealing things or being bad, but how about it's an ecosystem of predators eating resources in an environment. And so we built, and I got to read a lot about parasites and orcas hunting together, and things I never expected to read. And we created these sort of 8 metaphors based on ecosystems. The model is massive right now, and if you want to discuss it more and have ideas of what we could do with it, that'd be great, because I don't know yet. But when we discovered these sort of 8 types of corrupt people, which are manipulators, exploiters, schemers, deceivers, networkers, cannibals, snatchers, and gatekeepers. And we characterize them based, manipulators and snatchers are more parasites, exploiters and networkers are more sort of like large, big hunting animals, like predators, like mammals, really, like tigers or whales or things like that. And schemers are both, are more sort of like poisonous animals, and deceivers and cannibals are more similar to sort of animals that can mimetize or that can use mimicry to hunt. Um, and it helps us, at least to me, what it gave me is an idea of what to look for. You know, as I was saying, if you can vectorize behavior, it's easier to understand the outcome of the system. So maybe if we can sort of use these metaphors in this model to understand what kind of predator is each of these sort of potential corrupt people, then we can imagine the kind of environment they hunt in, right? And what we looked at is that, for example, for manipulators, they're more prone to hunt in corporate government or governmental institutions that lack oversight, whereas exploiters are more prone to appear in weak governance and regulatory enforcement, right? Schemers occur more in environments with limited accountability and transparency. So this is just examples, but what I'm showing you here is that when you mix, for example, attitudinal behavior with psychological traits, with how people behave, even if we can't see the person, even if it's, the person is hidden from us, we can expect how they'll behave, and we can sort of expect where they'll show up based on their habits, just like a predator. You know that big animals, hunting animals, drink water, so you expect them to be close watering holes, but also because their prey also needs to drink. So you can say, well, if I want to take a photograph of a tiger, you know, why not wait near water? They'll show up eventually. So it could be the same thing. Instead of trying to prevent and police the entire system, could we sort of set up our National Geographic photographers, you know, the corrupt hunters, sort of stationed in specific places of the system where we expect them to misbehave, so it's easier and less expensive to capture them and to trap them. So this is just something we've been discussing, and hopefully this gives you an idea of how individual environment interactions work. And this is my story. Hope you liked it, and hopefully we have enough time to continue discussing. I'll be very happy to continue the discussion.
Alejandro, that was fantastic, mate.
Thank you. Hopefully they enjoyed it too.
I'm sure they did. Look, we've got a couple of questions. Wouldn't any first-time behavior be a turning point because one doesn't have any first-hand experience of it yet, and therefore it leads to thinking and reacting?
So your question is, we don't, so if it's your first time, is it a turning point? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, exactly. Right. So if it's the less you've done something, the more sort of conscious, or the more your volition has to in some way engage to make the decision. Right. The more you've done something, the less actually you are thinking about it, the less conscious you're about it, the less you are really free to do it. Right. So I think that's part of the sort of process, and it's really good, right? So that's why if you're introducing something new, you have the best chance, right, of tailoring that sort of turning point in a great way. But if you miss that opportunity, the more time that passes, the harder it is to change the behavior, right? So I like transportation systems because they're visible, right? If you're a transportation system and you design the system very poorly in the beginning, or you interact with people very poorly, what you'll get is a really terrible sort of first turning point, and people will engage with the system in a very bad way. And then the more time that passes, the worse it's going to be to change their behavior. Like, oh, right, you get some transportation systems in the world, in the global south, losing $15 million in terms of public destruction. You know, they breaking part of the system every year, $15 million of just people breaking a glass, everything. Consciously, not by mistake, but because they're angry with the system. Imagine saving $15 million a year. It's insane not to expect that, right? Why are we losing $15 million because we suck at designing turning points, right? It's true. So yeah, great question, Aaron. Thank you.
Nice. And then there was quite a few people that wanted to know the answer to this. How did you measure personality types in your experiment?
Ooh, that's a really good question. It's a tricky one. So I'm having a lot of issues with this. I don't know if you've seen the recent literature saying that when you take, say, the Big Five inventory, even if it's beautifully translated and validated and everything, we're not getting the same kind of results in the global south as in the global north. So kind of worrisome. But the other thing is, I don't know if you feel the same thing I do, but when you do a personality questionnaire, there are some things you really don't want to say yes to, right? Like, are you anxious all the time? Yes, I am, but I'm going to say no. Do you hate your life? I'm kind of exaggerating. Like, no, I love it, but you do kind of hate it. How much social desirability are some of these traits sort of trying to bias us towards, right? So no one comes up neurotic, right? No one comes warrior. Everyone is like, no, I'm so good, right? And when you do it for personnel selection, it's worse. Who is going to say in their right mind when they're applying for a job, yeah, I'm kind of unstable, I'm kind of weird, and I yell at people. It's kind of insane. So one of the things we've done, right, is I'm completely obsessed with trying to measure personality more implicitly. So what we're doing now is we're getting these sentences that all look very positive, really sort of short sentences, and you get people to pick some of these sentences in an order. And when we've done is we run the Big Five inventory with a sentence, and then we've done hundreds of interviews to validate how closely the sentences actually relate to how people respond in an interview as well, not just the questionnaire, right? Things that we can sort of more nuanced, more sort of subtle, how people react if they come like, I'm so sorry, I was late, and you're like, well, you're a bit anxious here, and then the other person comes in late, but they're not so worried, right? Helps you kind of figure it out. And what we've seen is that these sentences that have less social desirability, they all have a positive and a negative side to the sentence, right? And we've discovered that people are more sincere about their personality, be it because they're more aware of the pros and cons, or maybe because it's harder for them to just look at only the positive things and lie or misrepresent the negative things. And that has helped us to see a little bit more clearly that there are more people with emotional instability traits, that are more worriers out there than we expected. And that it's not as clean cut as we thought it to be, but it's still a work in progress. And I'm sure you are all worried about how these questionnaires are really sort of, in a way, reflecting who we really are. It's a problem, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And mate, we'll give you one more question. Let's just get on. How do you envision these insights on individual environment interactions being used for system change? And what is the most appropriate level? E.g. government, normative, individual,
Can you go back? It just cut in a really important moment. Can you ask the question again? I don't know. Is it in the chat or?
Yeah, it's in the chat. It's from Josh down the bottom. How do you envision these insights on individual environment interactions being used for system change? And what is the most appropriate level, e.g. government, normative, individual, of intervention leveraging these insights?
Wow, John, that's a really good question. It's a really difficult one. So that's like the $1 million, lots of $1 million questions. So tough one, right? I think that the first thing I think about is, how do we calibrate enough individuality into the model, but not too much, right? As I was saying, my concern is that we are so obsessed with being special and different, and everyone being, individual and being completely different, that I think it's messing up our models, because we're just saying, oh, everyone is special, everyone is it, right? See, it's so expensive to measure variability. It's so expensive to measure individuality. So what I would think is, can we begin by trying to understand which factors are more relevant to predict the hawk rabbit race, right? So if you don't care really if the hawk is flying or the rabbit is jumping, what you care about is how quickly they'll reach the end of the field, right? So in some maybe studies in certain systems. You might be interested in whether the hawk is flying and the rabbit is jumping, but in others not. So right. So in some you'll focus on the rabbit having jumping legs and then the hawk having wings, but in other systems you just want to know when they'll show up. So I think the first thing we need to do is to figure out what we want to measure, what is the outcome variable, right? And then ask, well, what are the factors that help me predict these outcome variable? And it's becoming easier, right? These sort of large AI models, while they still make mistakes and have a lot of variability, they're showing us that in the end, it will be possible to analyze massive amounts of data. So the problem will not be the data, but are we going to feed these models massive amounts of variability and then make them really confused about what we want to do? Or are we going to feed them interesting factors about the potential outcomes of people and being able to measure them? So I think the first thing we need to do is sit down, right? And the other thing that I think, and what I was showing about corruption, is that we need to characterize things before we start measuring them, you know? We've been talking about corruption for nearly 3 or 4 decades, seriously about corruption. And we still don't know how it's formed. And if you say, no, we know it perfectly, I'll be very interested in what you have to say, but also very concerned because I've been reading for the last 3 years, 4 or 5 years actually. And my feeling is we don't really know how someone becomes corrupt. Do they begin like that? Is it just the parents? Is it the society? Well, what is it? And probably there's not a single answer. But we have no typologies for corrupt people. Like I showed you 8 here, and they're just like in its infancy. But I would really like to know more about it. So I think we need to characterize things before we measure them. And we're doing a really poor job. We just say we need people to save water. We don't even ask. So who is not saving water? What is the life of someone that doesn't save water? What is their lifestyle? What are they thinking? We have so many assumptions when we're building policy about what causes these outcome sort of behaviors. And I think that's where these sort of individual environment interactions should put us in. It shouldn't be trickier. It should be clearer, right? It should be more transparent. I think hopefully I answered your question because it was very difficult. It's a very good question. Thank you.
Awesome. Alejandro, so much gratitude to you, mate. Thank you for getting up at 4 a.m. to give this talk. There's a lot of love in the chat. A lot of thanks for your talk. For anyone that wants to see more of Alejandro, he does have a couple of TEDx talks on YouTube, so be sure to hit them up as well. Hopefully we get you back again in the future, because I think you could do a whole nother talk on corruption in itself.
No, I'm so happy. I would love that. I think in a month or so, maybe a couple of months, we'll have more data and a clearer perspective. Hopefully, a nicer visualization, because we were working on it, but it was just too much information for one talk. But hopefully, by then we'll have a neater sort of thing where we can look at the ecosystem which each of the corrupt people hunt and how it looks like and what it looks like. I would love that. So, Aaron, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for the great questions. Please keep in touch if any of you are interested in having a deeper, longer conversation about this. I'm very happy to have it.
Thank you, mate. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thanks. See you.